Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, how to unpack the ROI of Database DevOps. I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. I'm super excited to talk to you about this topic. Often in these the series of webinars that I've been producing, I've been talking very much about the technical detail and what you can actually achieve. But of course, in my role, I work with organizations all across the globe that are looking to put this into place, and often the people that I'm partnering with within the organization really struggles with how to capture and represent the return on investment that's possible by embracing some of these processes and techniques that we see collectively known as database DevOps. So it's wonderful for me to be able to talk through some of my experiences and some of the things that I've seen out there, and how perhaps you can package this information up to present your own case and really work out what your own return on investment could be. So first of all, let me introduce myself. For those of you who haven't seen me present before, my name's Tom Austin and I'm Head of Pre-Sales Engineering at Redgate Software. I look after the EMEA and APAC regions, and I've been with Redgate for a little over 10 years now. Now, all of that time has really been spent around helping people with their database change management program. So right in the early days, I was really focused around getting people up and running with tools like Redgate SQL Compare to allow them to compare and synchronize their database schemas. Shortly after that, we introduced SQL source control and saw a big push out there for people trying to capture their database changes alongside their application changes in their source control repository, and so linking that up as part of a process alongside SQL Compare was a really exciting transition for us to make. We then saw an increasing amount of automation, which I guess led to agile practices, and most recently we've been talking much more about DevOps, and specifically in my case database DevOps. So I'm lucky enough to have been involved with the DLM training courses, database lifecycle management training courses that Redgate put together, and I've delivered those across the region that I'm responsible for, and worked with, as I say, organizations that are very small, very large, databases that are very complex, and pretty much everything in between, really. So there's very few things I'm yet to see in this space, shall we say. So today I am talking to you about the return on investment. I'm going to break this down into a few different sections, which we'll cover the agenda in just a moment. But there are, just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things that I just want to mention for those of you that perhaps haven't attended this before. Now, we are expecting quite a large number of attendees today, so to keep the audio as clear as possible, we will be having everybody's microphones muted. I do apologise about that. I'd love to talk to you one-on-one, but unfortunately with the number it's just not possible. So instead, we do have the chat functionality that's available in your GoToWebinar console. So if anything pops up that you have a question about, or there's anything that I've said that's unclear, please by all means do tap in your responses to the questions section in the console, or alternatively you're free to use the chat window as well. I will keep my eye on both of those, and certainly when it comes to the end of the presentation, I've made sure that there's plenty of time for us to cover any questions that have come out of the topics that have been discussed. So don't worry, I won't miss them out. You'll get the answers if you just pop them in the box there. Now, in addition to this, we are recording today's session, and this recording will be made available to you afterwards, along with the slide deck. So all of the material that I use today, you can grab and take for your own purposes. And if you want to show it to the rest of your team or somebody else who might be interested in this topic area, then please do not worry. We will certainly make those bits and pieces available to you afterwards. We've also got links to anything that we reference in the material today, so you'll be able to grab those from the presentation directly. They should all be referenced, but if there's anything at all that isn't covered that you want access to, then feel free to drop me an email, tom.austin@red-gate.com, and I will be absolutely happy to help in any way I can. So our agenda today, first of all, I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to Redgate as an organization, and then also, as usual, we just cover off the answer to that all-important question, what is DevOps? As some of you may know, I like to kind of start with this so that we're all on the same page. It's very rare that you get two people who define DevOps as exactly the same thing, so at least if I give you my interpretation or the interpretation of DevOps that I warm to most, then you know the position that I'm coming from when I refer to these things later on in the presentation. Once we've done that, we'll look at how there is growing evidence that actually DevOps is becoming much, much more mainstream. Once upon a time, it was quite an aspirational thing. We're a good few years into the DevOps movement now, and actually rather than something that is carried out by a small minority of super advanced teams, this is becoming more and more common in everyday organizations that I see, even in industries where perhaps you wouldn't expect such new practices being embraced. I struggle really to go anywhere these days without being asked something in relation to DevOps or a different level of adopting DevOps within those organizations. But that's largely talking about DevOps in its broadest sense, the coming together of development and operations. What we want to talk to you about specifically from a Redgate point of view is, of course, how the database fits in as part of this. And so we'll just spend a moment just to look at exactly what the differences are between general DevOps practices and when it comes to database DevOps, what we should be aware of, and also look at why it's important to consider it as part of it. Now, the main bulk of the topic that I want to discuss today is the return on investment of database DevOps. And we'll see that this can be broken down into a couple of different areas, a couple of slightly different ways of thinking. And also, when it comes to return on investment, there's slightly different emphasis that needs to be placed on the information, depending on who your audience is. And so we'll look at the viewpoints of 2 or 3 different members of organizations and see how we need to package up the information in an appropriate way so that people are getting access to the bits that are really important to them. And this is based largely off some research that was done that I'll give you some insight into later, as well as the experiences of everybody here in the Redgate offices, who of course have been working for a number of months, a number of years with organizations who, as I mentioned, are at various different levels of adoption of their DevOps journey. So for everybody who's not familiar with Redgate software, or for those of you who need a refresher, Redgate's a company that's based in Cambridge in the UK. We have a total of 3 offices globally, one which I'm based in Cambridge, and then 2 over in the US, one in Pasadena and one in Austin, Texas. And there's about 230 Redgaters in total. We are 18 years old. We'll be celebrating our 19th birthday in October. And we have over 200,000 customers using Redgate's products. And Redgate's products really span quite a wide spectrum of different use cases. But our specialty really lies in helping SQL Server and Oracle DBAs and developers to manage the whole database development lifecycle. So everything from planning changes to our database schemas to actually deploying that out and monitoring that and everything in between. So more recently, we've been involved in how we can apply some of our technology to some of the new and emerging compliance regulations and making sure that not only are we able to deliver change at pace, but we can do so in a robust, reliable, compliant way as well. We have a number of community resources such as SQL Server Central and SimpleTalk, where you can get a whole bunch of content. Please, if you haven't checked those out, then I'd encourage you to go and have a look. We have over 2 million users making use of those resources, with 4 million website visits each year. So we recently launched the hub, which has, again, even more largely Redgate product specific, or at least touching on the areas around the Redgate products. So if you haven't looked at the hub yet, please do go and take a look at that. I mentioned the range in size of our customers. You can see here that actually most of our very big customers, or most of the very big customers out there, are using Redgate tools. So 91% of Fortune 100 use Redgate products. But the most important thing on this page for me really is this product releases statistic. So it's all very well and good us talking about these topics, but we actually believe this, we practice this ourselves. So everything that you see Redgate talking about in the webinars or events that you may attend where we have people speaking on stage, we practice this ourselves. So we had 1,147 product releases last year. So we really do believe that it's possible to deploy changes frequently. So now you know about Redgate, let's set the scene with our take on DevOps. Now, as I said earlier, there are so many different definitions of what DevOps is. If you took 100 people, you'd probably end up with 101 definitions. But actually, I like Donovan Brown's definition the best. So I've seen Donovan speak a number of times. I saw him most recently at Techorama over in Belgium last week. And Donovan defines DevOps as the union of people, process and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. And he always points out that, you know, it's all about delivering value. It must be a process that actually ships something of use to somebody. We can't just continue to push out code that nobody wants to use, or poor code, or, you know, an experience that is less than optimal. In fact, in his presentation that he gave last week, he was speaking specifically about mobile DevOps. And one of the really interesting things that I took away from it was that, you know, it's even more important to make sure that you're delivering value and working software in the mobile space, because, you know, with 101 apps for every possible thing you could think of in the App Store these days, if you download one, try it, and it doesn't do what you expect it to, or it doesn't work, or it has some kind of bug, you don't in 6 weeks time decide, actually I'm going to grab this same app again and give it another go. You just move on to one of the other ones. So you've got to make sure that actually everything that reaches your end users is functioning, is working. Otherwise, you know, you're just going to disappear. But Donovan also points out that there are three components here that we need to consider at least equally. So people, process and product. You cannot just buy DevOps off the shelf. You can't go and buy a tool set and the next day wake up and say, hey, we're doing DevOps. It does require these different components to come together. You need the right processes and the people to come together to embrace those processes. And actually, one of the things that we've seen historically is that by using the right tools and products, you can facilitate this process much more easily. The people are more bought in to adopting the processes if the tools make that adoption easier for them. So actually, the coming together of these elements is aligned very much with what Redgate wish to deliver out into the market with our ingeniously simple tools. So if DevOps is this wonderful thing, why is it that everybody I speak to wants to talk to me about it in some way, shape or form? Well, actually, there's growing evidence of why DevOps is something that really can transform businesses. I mean, the statistics that you see on the screen here are taken from the 2017 State of DevOps report, which is produced jointly by Puppet and Dora, DevOps Research and Assessment. And there's, if you haven't read this before, I thoroughly encourage you to head on over to the website and download this. It's a brilliant report that highlights some really, really key information. Some of the highlights that you can see on the screen here at the moment, absolutely phenomenal figures. So 440 times faster lead times. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. One of the organizations that I was working with the week before last actually were currently looking at this report, and they asked me what my take on this kind of top level statistic is. And put simply, if you've got 46 times more frequent deployments, it's buying you 45 mistakes essentially. If you're able to deliver 46 versions of your software in the time it takes somebody else to deliver one, then you've really got the competitive advantage there. You're able to adapt, you're able to adjust, you're able to correct, and you can deliver that new version all whilst your competitors or other people in the market are still planning what they're thinking about doing in their next release. So, massive numbers. And of course, 96 times faster recovery from failures. We'll see later on, actually, that some statistics or some presentations actually report that the cost of IT failures can be huge, talking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. And so anything that reduces the time it takes to recover from those failures is, of course, something that we would be interested in embracing within our organization. We also present alongside this report our own State of Database DevOps report, and that has also got a wealth of information that shows that DevOps is becoming mainstream. If we look here, these statistics are taken from one of the questions in the 2018 State of Database DevOps report, which again is available from the Redgate website. If you can't find it, then please do get in touch and I'll send you a link where you can grab this from. But you can see here that 52% of respondents had already adopted a DevOps approach to some or all of their projects, and that's a 10% increase on last year, and a really clear demonstration that DevOps is firmly established in the mainstream now. You're now in a minority if you haven't even considered adopting some of this across all of your projects. A further 30% on top of that 52 plan to adopt it during the next 2 years. So there's really only 18% of people that are, well, for want of a better phrase, ignoring that DevOps is the way forward. And so they don't currently have any plans to adopt that within the next 2 years anyway within their organization. Now, it's possible that they see DevOps as something that's maybe 3 or 5 years out, but with the pace of change these days, I suspect that they don't have any plans around that at all at the moment. So we know DevOps is here, we know it's here to stay. We've seen from some of the statistics that have been shown in the State of DevOps report that there's huge benefits, but how does this specifically relate to the database? Well, this is really where Redgate come in. This is our area of expertise, and there's a really clear distinction in many organizations that I work with between the database and the application or the service that they're working on. And often I speak to people, whether it be on site with them or at an event, and they really talk quite passionately about the processes that they've been able to put in place and the procedures that they've adopted that are really enabling them to deliver their software faster and more reliably. And quite rightly, they're very proud of this. But when I push back slightly and say, oh, that's great, and I take it the same thing happens when you need to make a database change alongside the application change, often it goes very quiet, and it's times then often the case that people say, well, if it's a change that also requires a database change, then we do those every other Thursday. So all of a sudden, instead of this kind of 15-minute cycle from actually committing the change to source control and having it deployed out to production, all of a sudden we're on a kind of cycle time of weeks, maybe even months. And this is really losing all of that benefit. Many of our software packages that we're working on are unable to exist without a database. In fact, it's very unusual for me to speak to people who don't have some kind of data storage need. And so there is going to be a change that relies on you making a change to the database as well. And at those times, you shouldn't be held back. The database really shouldn't be the bottleneck to your DevOps success. Now, why is this the case? So why is it that people are not including the database in these processes? Well, I think, first of all, it's true that historically, DevOps is very application-centric. The practices and processes of been born out of the software development world that's focused around application code. There has been very little tooling to support even the foundations of DevOps processes. So just the ability to capture database change in source control is very recent compared to the ability to capture application code changes in source control. And actually, databases can be a little bit harder to handle. They contain data, and so they need to be safely manipulated, and all of the contents needs to be correctly preserved. With most applications, you can pretty much throw away the old version and put a new version in its place. There's very, very, very few organizations that I've met that would be willing to throw away the old version of their database and start again from scratch every time they wish to make a database deployment. And so, we need to be cautious. But it's a problem that we need to push through. We need to be able to make sure that our database changes are synchronized with the pace of our application development team. It's really unacceptable these days to say, well, we're all ready to go. We're just waiting for the DBAs to approve a deployment, or have half of your organization on hold whilst you're waiting for this very old traditional approach to database development, where the rest of the organization working on the application has already adopted things that are allowing them to deliver these benefits. And actually, all of the benefits that we spoke about earlier, those increases in IT performance measures, they're only exaggerated by applying the same principles to the database. If you can do the same to your database as you can with your application, then the chances are that you're going to achieve increases more and more in excess of the ones that we saw on that previous slide. And this is not strange news to our teams. The research that we did with the State of DevOps report showed us that actually overwhelmingly the majority of teams contain developers who are responsible for not just the application, but also database changes as well. And actually, if you compare the proportion of people who responded in this way and split them into groups who had already adopted DevOps approaches and haven't already adopted DevOps approaches, then actually the proportion remains pretty similar. So this is a very common thing that we see, that people are touching both the application and the database. And in fact, this has increased since the first year that we put together this report. So in fact, not only is it a huge majority, but actually it's growing. The number of people who have responsibility for both is on the up. Now, of course, I mentioned much earlier the changes in legislation and regulations that are coming into place. And, people often ask me, how can we have both? How is it possible to have a kind of rigid, compliant data governance program alongside this adoption of DevOps, which of course is seen as increasing the pace of delivering change? Well, and of course, as many of you will be aware, the main legislation change that I'm referring to here is the GDPR, which is relevant to anybody who holds or tracks citizens of the European Union. But there's also other recognized regulations that we need to adhere to as well, many that have been around for a long, long time, so HIPAA and SOX and POPI, many different things. And as I say, it's often seen as this conflict, data governance and DevOps, because the increase in the speed at which we change, which comes from embracing DevOps, is seen as risk. However, in the research that we conducted, 64% of respondents said that a DevOps approach to the database had a positive impact on data governance, and only 5% said that it had a negative impact. Now, I think this is likely because alongside that increase in pace and that more frequent delivery, DevOps actually introduces much more managed processes, and the outcomes of those processes are much more predictable. So we actually simplify compliance by enabling the software to be delivered in a consistent, reliable, and repeatable way. And of course, by using things like source control across the application and the database, we're providing a completely auditable trail of those changes all along the way. So interestingly, a further point on the statistics here, again, if you haven't looked at this report, please do head over to the website and download it. 2018 State of Database DevOps report is the latest version. But on top of the information we can see here, if we split these respondents into those that have considered their data governance program to be successful or very successful, then actually 72% of that group felt that a DevOps approach to the database had a positive impact. So people who felt like their data governance program was going really well really also felt that that was a lot down to the DevOps approaches that they'd put in place. So let's get back to the topic at hand here. We wanted to think about how we approach return on investment when we're talking specifically about database DevOps. And to answer this, I mean, we need more than just promises. We can't be in a position where we say, oh, you know, we've read these reports and everybody says that it's going to be great if we adopt DevOps. We can't do that. We need to understand the return on investment with facts and figures that demonstrate the gains that are available to us as an organization. And really to be able to identify the real return on investment of implementing DevOps processes within your or applying them to your database, you need to answer these two questions. And what are the key drivers for your business, and what matters most to each of the stakeholders? And the answers to these two questions can come in two different forms. So we might have value-driven benefits. So the example that we've given here is that it might make it possible to unlock investment into development earlier by releasing to market faster, and therefore we get that competitive advantage that we were talking about. So, you know, I mentioned if we can do 46 times more frequent releases, then we get 45 more goes than our competitors. Or they might be more traditional cost-driven savings. So, you know, the dollar value of the hours saved compared to the processes that we were undertaking previously. And of course, there might be a mix of these two different answers to these questions. Now, if you can demonstrate that the projected impact of DevOps on these metrics is going to be positive, then you've got a strong case to take to those people that need to make the decision on adopting DevOps. Because, as we said earlier, this is not something that is a quick, easy win. You know, this is a shift in the way that we undertake producing software, and it's an investment in the future, and sometimes that takes time. And so we need to really go to the senior leadership team or the exec team who are going to be the sponsors of this within our organization, and really show them that there is this pot of gold at the end of the journey. So, you know, we're going to go through some pain, we're going to go through some transition, it's going to take some time, but this is what we think we can get back from it. So it's really, really important to be able to do this. Now, I mentioned that we are taking some of the knowledge that we're going to be referring to here from some research. So this was David Linwood's MSc in Management at Ashridge Business School. He produced a project to discover the key success factors of DevOps, and listed them out here, the 7 most cited metrics for measuring the impact of DevOps: faster speed and lower cost of a release, improved operational support and faster fixes, faster time to market, higher quality products, lower volume of defects, improved frequency of new releases and features, and good processes across IT and teams, including automation. Now, so much of this is pivotal around that automation element. DevOps is much more than automation, but automation forms a key core element of any DevOps program. Now, of course, if you asked anybody involved in IT what the business benefits of DevOps are, you're likely to get a range of answers as broad as this, if not broader. And this is because, well, often because different stakeholders within an organization have their own particular focus. It's not the case that one or two of these key success factors is important to everybody. What matters to a CEO, for example, may well be at odds with the viewpoint of a development team manager. But And these 7 that you see on the screen here, these seem to be cited by all stakeholders. However, of course, the priorities that we see are different depending on who we're speaking to. So what I want to do is just take a moment just to look into a few different stakeholders and what we've found from the research might be their perspective on this. So let's start with the CEO. So here, when we look through look at DevOps through the eyes of the CEO, it's much more about the business outcome, how investment in DevOps will lead to higher profitability. And so we can see here that list of the 7 that we saw earlier is kind of cut down. Notice how faster speed and lower cost of a release, along with that improved operational support and faster fixes, have disappeared off the radar. And while those may be of concern, a faster time to market and higher quality products are more important to CEOs. That's where they really place the value. And a lower cost isn't linked to releases. It's a benefit on its own, and this applies across the board. So we mentioned as well the cost of IT failures, and you can see here $100,000 per hour as reference IDC DevOps and the cost of downtime 2015. Any reduction in this downtime, it can relate to huge cost savings, and that dollar value can be part of the return on investment that we see from adopting these practices, which, remember, allow us to recover 96 times more frequently. So you know, you can put this into real dollar value terms using industry averages very easily. But interestingly, customer satisfaction, this one stands out for me. You know, the CEO knows that he needs to keep customers happy for them to return. And so this is another one that features quite heavily on the list. Now, if we wanted to take a contrasting view to the CEO, we might look at the view through the CIO lens. Now here we see things more like efficient processes to increase the throughput of the IT department and quantifiable cost of recruitment and retention. And this leads me on to one of the things that I found fascinating when I was first looking into the world of DevOps. And that's around this kind of engagement and satisfaction level. And it isn't always immediately apparent, but actually by having DevOps practices and approaches, there's a lot of reduction in unplanned and unnecessary work. So going back to the State of DevOps report, that report that found that organizations who were measured as high performers and practicing DevOps approaches, they spent 21% less time on unplanned work and unnecessary work. And actually that led to 44% more time on new work compared to their lower performing peers. And not only was the throughput higher, but spending more time on that enjoyable value add development led to much higher levels of employee satisfaction and therefore greater employee retention and, you know, happy teams working together delivering software without the constant need to kind of fill gaps as people left the team or went to work on other projects. Another thing that I took away from the conference that I attended recently was a talk on how Microsoft delivers software. And one of the things they were talking about is that at the end of each phase of the project, they have all of these different teams that are working together to deliver VSTS. And there's 50 different teams working on 50 different areas to deliver VSTS. And in each of these end of these segments, everybody's encouraged to go and put their name on a post-it note under the team that they want to work with and that they want to work on from that point on. And that's because, you know, it can be difficult if you're working on the Git element of VSTS. It might be frustrating to spend more than a few phases working on that. But actually what they were saying was that because of the way that they deliver their software and the way that the teams are created and how engaged the employees are and how valued the team units are, over 80% of the teams actually choose to stay in the same team that they're already working on rather than move to a different area. And that has huge knock-on effects. So we can see some contrast here. It's different to the way that a CEO would view this. And finally, I want to call out the IT manager as well. IT managers are driven by the faster speed of releases and that reduced volume of defects. And it comes as no surprise that they're concerned with aspects that they will be judged by and their performance is measured on. The things that are valuable to an IT manager directly relate to the things that make them good at their job. And so it shouldn't be news to us that these differences exist. But a word of caution, of course, recognizing the benefits that IT managers seek from DevOps is one thing. But as we've seen, CEOs and CIOs have a different point of view. And when the benefits of DevOps are considered from their perspective, the different stories emerge. So if you're looking at ways to introduce a DevOps initiative into your organization, it should be framed really around the benefits everyone can gain rather than at the differences that we've outlined here, the differences that exist. If you have a particular target for your report, then of course there are certain things that you might want to pull in there, but generally speaking, if you look at the general benefits across the board, then that's a much more compelling case to put forward to members of a team that might be jointly making the decision. So just bear this in mind when you're doing your own work on this. So how can we actually calculate the dollar value of DevOps? We've spoken a bit about kind of these softer benefits, the increased throughput, the increased employee engagement, but also we want to be aware of the actual dollar value of the benefits that we're getting through embracing database DevOps. And so really there's 5 different areas that need to be considered here. First of all, the cost of software development. So by this, typically what we're talking about here is the average cost or the average hourly rate of producing a piece of software. This might be the typical cost of a software developer working on the project, or the average cost of the DBA and the SQL development team working on a project. But once you have that kind of averaged hourly cost, we can calculate the cost of introducing a new process by multiplying that by the time taken to train everybody up on this new approach, to introduce them to the new tools that they will need to embrace to actually make the vision a reality. The time saved times by the average hourly cost will give you the overall total savings. So if you've calculated the cost of introducing the new process, you've been able to work out how much time you will save, and you can multiply that by an average hourly cost. You can then take away the cost of introduction from the savings to give you that dollar value that's actually realized. And of course, as we mentioned, alongside that monetary benefit, you've also got those non-revenue based business benefits that we were referring to. Now, at Redgate, we typically break these down into a few different areas of DevOps and specifically database DevOps. DevOps is a huge area that touches upon many, many different parts. And so for us here, when we define the database development process, we can break this down into 8 different steps, which are grouped into 3 different stages. So you can see the 8 different steps around the outside of the cog here, and we group these into the 3 categories. So category number 1, development environment and practices. The steps provision, develop and build are all included in this category, and it's about encouraging good visibility among teams, sharing code, changes or data, and the consistent use of processes and automation that removes bottlenecks. So for example, automating the provisioning of database copies gives developers more freedom to test their changes. Introducing version control maintains a single point of truth for collaborative work, and introducing standardized coding format allows code to be more easily shared and amended across the team. And if you're interested in some of those standardization topics that I mentioned there, if you head onto our webinars page, maybe a month ago, I delivered a webinar that was touched on kind of 3 different areas of standardization that we can bring into our organization. The second area here is this area of continuous integration and deployment. So this is all around those topic areas of validate and test, package and release. Validating and testing code with a continuous integration process is becoming standard practice. It's so incredibly common in application development. I mean, you know, a few months or maybe even years ago, it was every time you spoke to a software developer, if you asked them if they would ever consider writing code without having it in source control, they would laugh at you. Then it's now reaching that point with continuous integration. Everybody is doing this on the application side. Each change is committed to version control. It triggers a build process that tests and validates the code. And we can do exactly the same thing for our database changes. So we can ensure that actually as our unit tests for the application code are all passing based upon the new changes that we've added to the repository, equally the changes that we've made to the underlying database structure should be checked, and we need to make sure that we're happy with those changes and they're not going to cause problems as well. This can be extended, of course, to release automation, and therefore we can make sure that the way that we deploy our software out to our target SQL Server instances is always done in exactly the same way. It's predictable, and if we do it in the same way for each of the environments in our environment chain, then by the time we get to production, we can be very, very confident that actually any issues have already been picked up on, and if they were, that process would have stopped. And the final category here, protecting and preserving data. So this final step includes monitor and optimize and backup. And these are, you know, just as important of everything else. In fact, the increased speed of delivery and automation means that monitoring is even more important, as that database entity that was kind of relatively static previously starts coming into this state of constant change. The more and more frequently we're updating the database, the more important it is that we have a view on exactly what the effect of those changes is. And so real-time database monitoring becomes important, as does the kind of checks, the business checks that we need to apply to our database to ensure that we remain compliant with the GDPR that came into effect last week. So backups and access controls need to be in line with the regulation. We need to know that the right to be forgotten is another area that I think people are forgetting about often. We need to know that if somebody makes a request to remove their details from our data set, we have to be able to access our database to do that. And so actually we need to know all the time that we do have access to our databases. And if the connection's down for some reason or our SQL server is unreachable, a real-time monitoring solution is going to report that to you so that you can take the necessary reactive steps to that. So those are our three categories. I'd like to give you an example from each of these categories, really. So the first one here is Moodys Analytics, and these guys were using Redgate's SQL Clone. So SQL Clone is Redgate's provisioning tool, and that ability to provision realistic environments for developers to develop and testers or developers to test against, it's an essential part of that DevOps process, as it lets the developers test changes against an up-to-date version of the database and find errors earlier. You know, the closer your test environment is or your development environment is to your production environment, the more likely you are to find those errors earlier on in the story. It's not going to be a case of, oh well, you know, there's such disparity between our test environments and our production environments that we're never going to find out if there's going to be a problem until it gets that close to production. So with this organization in particular, their production databases were now up to 3 terabytes or more in size. So moving around copies of this data and finding space to keep copies of this data were a real problem. So the need to kind of have these dev and test environments refreshed frequently to keep pace with that ongoing development was a real struggle. But by introducing Redgate SQL Clone, which allows you to create a full copy or clone of your SQL Server database in seconds and only using a tiny footprint, so typically around about 40 to 100 megabytes of disk space, regardless of how big your source database is, then Moodys Analytics were able to make some pretty substantial savings. And so, I mean, typically, if we just look at this as I'm just going to read the statistics here from the case study that we did with these guys. So when SQL Clone was introduced, it reduced the provisioning time to 10 minutes for copies of all 6 databases involved. So that saved the company around about 200 minutes a day, which when you spread that or multiply that out across the year, that's 833 hours. So 833 hours at $65 an hour as an average comes to $54,000 and a little bit more. The cost of introducing the process, so this is the introduction of the software, the training that went on, was estimated at around about 80 hours. At that same cost of $65 an hour gives us $21,000. So over the first year, actually, the return on investment was 156%, $33,000. But actually, if we look at that over a 3-year period, then the numbers jump quite considerably, up to nearly $110,000 there, or 307% over the 3-year period. The second example that I'd like to share with you fits nicely into that second category that we looked at. So after provisioning, we spoke about continuous integration and deployment. So that we could automate the testing of database changes and find those problems earlier. A really good example of this is a major insurance company, AFSA Fossakring, and they chose Redgate SQL Toolbelt to replace its manual database deployment process and introduce automation to a development team that was about 20 strong in the first instance, and then this rolled out across the organization further. Now, the SQL Toolbelt contains a whole bunch of different tools to improve the efficiency and productivity of your development teams, but it also has the components that allow you to plug your database into your existing source control system, your continuous integration system, and your automated deployment tooling. And so you can reap all of those automated benefits that you gain from automation for the database too. And so here again, if we look at the savings, $130,000 or 1 year of a developer's salary, in this case was the gain. The introduction of the process will cost a little bit more. There was more people to train, and so it was 400 hours of acclimatization at $65 an hour. That gave us 91,000, but still over the first year, that's a little over $38,000 returned, or 41%. But again, scale that up over that 3-year period, which is where many of the organizations we spoke to measured their ROI based upon, then we're looking at 324% then. So that investment up front really repaid itself over and over again as that process was able to sustain that increased development frequency or delivery frequency, spotting those errors earlier. And the final example that I want to share with you today is Mamas and Papas. So another company that I'm really pleased to have been able to work with, UK-based retailer and manufacturer. They were looking for a tool to monitor their very, very large SQL Server estate, and they chose Redgate SQL Monitor. They loved it because of the intuitive interface, the configurable alerts. They also use Slack, much like we do here at Redgate, and so the fact that it's got integration with Slack was a huge bonus to those guys too. And this has saved at least 2 hours a day within the team there, because of the reduction in the need for the DBAs to go through that checklist on a daily basis. It's also actually adjusted the way that the team work, so it's changed the culture, because it's given them the ability to focus on being more productive rather than focusing on checking to see whether anything's gone wrong. They can get that out of the way very quickly by having sensible alerting mechanisms in place using SQL Monitor, and actually focus on how they can make things better. What many would say is the more enjoyable work that we might spend our days doing. And so again, if we look at the returns here, so 250 working days a year, 2 hours a day, that's 500 hours at $65 an hour. That's saved $32,500. Cost of introducing the process, software cost including 40 hours of training, a smaller team but managing a large estate. 40 hours was sufficient, and so that cost came in at 26,000. So again, even though the ROI over the first year was relatively small, if we look at the 3-year return, 274% again is a fantastic result for something that was a pleasurable thing for the organization to adopt. It wasn't a painful change for them to make. In fact, it was a change that they embraced and they really wanted to get in place. So that's a few examples taken from some of the teams that we've worked with. But of course, you want to know how you can apply this information to your own organization. That's what's really important. It's lovely to hear how other people have benefited and profited from these practices and approaches, but it's what the benefit to you is going to be that's most important. So I just want to remind you of the key points that we've touched upon today. So make sure you view the benefits through the lenses of the different stakeholders. Think about who you are speaking about here. Is it the CEO? Is it the CIO? Is it the IT manager? Is it a panel? Do we need to be more generalized in our benefits? Don't just think about the dollar value. Also think about those value-driven benefits as well. It's not just about the cost savings. And also remember that different organizations are at different stages in their DevOps journey. So we cannot expect some organizations overnight to embrace the full and complete DevOps pipeline. Sometimes it's a process that we go through. It's a staged implementation. Maybe we start by just getting our databases under source control, then introducing continuous integration, then maybe we start provisioning development environments using an automated process so that we free up some of the DBA's time. Then maybe we start monitoring our production environments to free up more of the DBA's time. So there's a lot of different stages that you might go through, and you might not do all of them at once, but each of them can have their own return on investment, or you can look at the bigger picture. And that's why really it depends on your goal and your tool choice. So, I mean, we mentioned the SQL tool belt. That's got 15 different tools spanning the whole development and deployment process. And that gave AFA a return of 325%. But it might be the case that actually the bit that causes you the most pain, or the biggest problem within your organization that needs to embrace a part of this database DevOps story, could be just one tool like SQL Monitor, and that could lead to a higher return on investment if it fits a specific aim of your organization. If that's the bit that hurts most, then fix that bit first. So as a bunch of next steps, my advice would be, number one, evaluate where your organization sits in its DevOps journey. Find out, if you think about those 3 different categories that we broke out those 8 different steps into, where are you in each of those? Are your processes quite mature, or are they quite at the early stages? Identify the metrics that you will be using to measure successful DevOps process implementation for your organization, and then baseline those metrics. So this is where we are today. This is what's important to us. This is where we are today. Then start adopting and embracing some of those DevOps practices and processes with maybe some tools to help smooth that transition, and then start measuring the rewards, the benefits that you get off the back of that. Of course, when I say here evaluate where your organization sits, Redgate are happy to help in this. We've worked with a huge number of organizations, and we kind of have gathered a wealth of information about what we would expect to see in organizations that are in different stages of maturity. And from that, we actually put together the Database DevOps Maturity Assessment Framework. And you can take this assessment, and it will give you feedback on where you currently sit in these kind of 3 different areas. Are you a beginner, are you intermediate, or are you advanced? And we'll be sending you a link to the maturity assessment along with the recording of the webinar after the event today. So so you'll be able to take that and get that starting point so that you can start measuring those changes. Okay, so that kind of brings me to the end of the material that I wanted to cover today with you all. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment whilst we allow people to tap in the questions that they may have, and I'll start reading some of those out in just a moment. Okay, so we've got 1 or 2 coming through. Again, anybody who has any further questions, please do tap them into the questions box, and I'll be happy to get to them. The first one that's come through here, though, it's okay. So this is asking about, in my experience, what is the most likely place to start to get the biggest return on investment? In all honesty, it's really, really difficult for me to tell you this. You know, your organization will know where things hurt. If it takes too long to test your new versions of your database software, then maybe automated testing is the thing that you need. If it's taking you, so the example that I mentioned about removing that daily checklist from the DBAs. I worked with another organization who spent much longer than 2 hours a day on this. There was a team of 5 that spent their entire morning on checking everything was still working as it should be. And so these 5 people spent from when they arrived until lunchtime going through these huge checklists, making sure nothing was any worse than it was when they left work the day before. So it was only after lunch that they were able to actually start delivering additional value. And so for that team, the most important thing they could introduce, the biggest benefit for them, was to focus on the monitoring side of things. If you forced me to make a choice, then I guess my recommendation, if you're not already source controlling your database code, that is the foundation of everything. So please, if anybody has yet to get their database into source control, that's really a problem that you need to fix. 1, it gives you an audit trail of who changed what, when, and why, but also 2, it allows you to form that solid foundation for things like continuous integration, like automated deployments. It really does open the door for so much. Another question here about how do you prevent? Okay, how do you prevent people resisting DevOps? Well, I think if your business case is right, the return on investment is right, then the senior leadership team should see the sense in it straight away. I guess maybe this question is based more around the members of the teams, and I think really the key thing to pull out here is it's not about replacing people with automation. What it's about is removing the parts of their job that they probably don't like spending their time on anyway. So, you know, if we look at the DBA team with that checklist, they didn't want to spend all morning going through the same checklist to make sure everything was okay. They wanted to improve performance. They wanted to work on the strategies that they had for making the database available more. You know, it wasn't what they wanted to spend their time doing. Likewise, developers, they don't want to spend time fixing the same problem over and over again, or, you know, getting 3 weeks into a project and then somebody saying, oh, you know, we tried to deploy that change but it didn't work, so can you go back and fix that thing that that you were working on 3 weeks ago. They want that kind of immediate feedback. They want the added value that they've put in the software to be out there in front of customers so that they can find out whether or not the customer likes the improvement. I mean, that's really one of the big benefits, that increase in employee engagement, by giving them the freedom almost to work on the things that excite not only them but also the business people within the organization, because they're able to retrieve the value that brings. You know, that happier customers mean more retention and greater number of signups, or whatever it might mean in your particular business. So yeah, I would really point out how important that is. Another question here about how is there any further resources around DevOps and Redgate solution? Yes, we have. I mean, I've covered a few areas in a very broad sense today. If there are particular parts of it that are of interest to you, then you can head on over to the Redgate website. In fact, there's the DevOps solution page, which is red-gate.com/DevOps. In fact, it's on the next slide. So if I forward this, yeah, so you can contact us at devops@red-gate.com if there are any resources that we can send you. You can also head to red-gate.com/DevOps and see a full overview of our complete solution. Guys, we are just about out of time. In fact, we're 2 minutes over. So I thank you very much for your attention today, and all of your questions that you've sent. Anybody whose question I didn't get to, please don't worry. I will email the answers over to you afterwards. But yes, thank you for giving me the time to talk through my experiences of how organisers have represented their return on investment, and I hope that it's something that will allow you to investigate what the return on investment within your organisation could be by embracing database DevOps. Thanks everybody. Bye bye.